Oh, check. Okay. Um, Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Data and Donuts for August. My name is John Neal. Work for the County of Los Angeles. On behalf of all of the Compiler LA team and the rest of the Data Donuts crew, really thank you for coming. We're going to have a pretty interesting conversation today, I think, about um, transformation in government. But before we get started on that, just a kind of a couple of announcements. So obviously we're live streaming. Also keep in mind that this is a workspace. As you see, it's a pretty interesting place if you've never been here before. But also just be respectful of the workspace, if you will. So this is Data and Donuts. Data and Donuts has been around since 2017. I know a lot of people, I see a lot of familiar faces, but if you're watching this on the live stream, or if you're new and you've never been to Data and Donuts is first and foremost a networking event. So that's why I'm really happy to see everybody here clustering up, talking about stuff, because this was born out of the idea that as civic technologists, we're all trying to solve the same problems, whether you work for the city, the state, metro, any of the Southern California area governments, anything like that. We're all trying to solve a lot of the same problems. And so this group came together as a way for civic technologists to share ideas and so on. And so in that spirit, we're here today, and thank you very much. We appreciate Lacey, all that good stuff. Also, we thank our sponsor, Metro. They help pay for a lot of the stuff we have, like our live stream and so on. So much appreciated. We like to also just call out some jobs. Obviously, you're not going to write this down really quick, but this will all be available on our site. But there are a couple of a transit analyst job. There's a mobility data job. There's also, I know, a GIS supervisor or GIS manager at LA County that just went live last week. We'll make sure all that stuff is on the website, but just want to make sure you're aware there's data jobs out there all across in the civic space. And here's all the job boards. Again, we have these on here so that when you look at the presentation, if you want to click and look, I'll call out the LA County one specifically. Okay, and obviously there's ways to get here as far as this. Oh, that's right. This is a transportation event. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide in my head. On September 15th, if you're interested, and you can go to the website to see that. Okay, so today's presentation is a little bit of a departure from how we normally do these presentations. Typically, we have somebody come up here with a really cool or a challenging problem with data and how they solve that problem. But today is kind of it's a book club. It's to discuss a specific book called Recoding America, why government is failing in the digital age and how we can do better. And this is kind of personal to me because back in the spring, I was at an event, an LA County event called Management Council, which is made up of managers and executives from all over the county of LA. And the last day, there's usually a keynote speech or a conversation with our chief executive. And this year, it was our chief executive, Fuchsia Davenport, and our speaker today, the deputy CEO, Joe Nicchitta, and they were talking about this book. And I was like, okay, yeah, leadership, blah, blah, blah. We've heard it all before. And, but as it went on and on, I realized that it was very much speaking to the challenges that we as technologists have in government and how we get stuff done. And the real aha moment was that I'm sitting in a room full of executives and they're starting to talk about Waterfall versus Agile. And I was just like, what the, I mean, are we really talking about system development lifecycle in front of executives? And that's kind of when it dawned on me that this book and our executives were speaking the language that us as technologists have been speaking for a long time. And so a week later, they did another presentation, the same presentation in the Board of Supervisors room with full of executives, department heads. It's the top echelon at the County of LA. And again, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what our executives are hearing. And I'm hearing from my bosses as well in my own organization how groundbreaking this book is, la, la, la. And it dawned on me that I thought it would be important that we discuss what our executives are hearing with the folks that are the implementers, right? In this story, there's electeds, there's executives, there's all kinds of different people, but there's the implementers, the people that have to implement the technology. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Deputy CEO for the County of LA, Joe Nicchitta, and we are going to do a little mini book review of this book, Recoding America by Jennifer Pahlka. So with that, Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you. You know, it's good to know, and John is probably right about this. When I get up to speak, people are like, blah, 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 here we go, more leadership talk. That's okay, because I think with this particular presentation, we struck a chord with folks, and so I'm happy to replicate it here. Our presentation that John sat through twice was like 2.5 hours long, so I have dramatically shortened it. So you're going to get a snippet of the book, not the whole book. Like we presented the whole book. We might as well have read it to everybody. But I've kind of condensed some of the concepts, and I'm actually going to hand some stuff out for you to look at while I am giving my presentation. And if you're on the live stream, just so you know, I am handing everybody $100. So John and I actually did cannabis together, professionally speaking, back in 2016 when the state, voters of the state passed Proposition 64. And let me just be clear, I am not a technology person. You're looking at a comparative literature major and attorney. I didn't even know what GIS was until like 2014 when Nick Franchino over there from regional planning was telling me, yeah, you can use maps for your work. And I was like, oh, really? So I was working on the implementation of Prop 64, the program side, and then John was working on the data side. So he was building dashboards and trying to track stuff. One of the things he was tracking was the resentencing of, under Prop 64, let me back up. The voters of the state essentially said cannabis should be legal. Like this is ridiculous. It's legal now, and everybody who is convicted of a crime related to cannabis, they should have their records essentially reduced or wiped clean, depending on what it was. And we're no longer going to tolerate that what's legal now and people are going to make money off in a commercial sense, that some people are actually going to be have these crimes hanging over their heads. So there were these resentencing provisions under Proposition 64, and the idea was, after the proposition passed, all of these people in LA County in particular, thousands of people, maybe over 100,000 people, were going to have their sentences reduced or wiped clean. But what we were finding, and I remember John was doing this, like all coming back to me as I was preparing for this morning. He had a dashboard that showed all of the folks who had their sentences either reduced or wiped clean, and it was like in the low double digits. It might have been 19 or 20 versus the eligibility, which was 100,000 plus. And we started to ask, like, what is going on here? And I didn't have a full sense of it until the Board of Supervisors, my governing board, basically directed me as I think my official title was weed lead, directed me to work with the DA and the public defender to figure out if we can get some synergy on the resentencing. So I met with the public defender and they were like, I don't understand why this is so hard. Just get in, we'll just resentence everybody, there shouldn't even be any opposition. I meet with the DA, not the DA, but the person at the DA's office who was leading it, and they told me, under the provision, we have an obligation to evaluate the circumstances of the crime. So if you had misdemeanor possession, but it was on a school grounds, we might object to having your sentence reduced. Or if you had a firearm with you, or it was an intent to sell, like we might want to actually object to that. So it turns out that the process to get resentenced, first of all, is very onerous. You have to go in, file a petition, like let's say it's been 10 years past, you got to find a lawyer, go back to your public defender, fill out all your information, they got to file it. It gets scheduled for hearing, the DA has a chance to object, it goes before a judge, it takes a long time. And even after you're, let's say the judge is like, yep, we're resentencing you, the system that records your resentencing or your expungement or whatever you got is delayed, and it's a state system, and I think the Judicial Council operates it, I think. And it could be delayed at the time, like 18 months or 2 years. So you might actually have yourself an order that says, I'm no longer convicted of a particular crime, but if you go for a job or you go apply for an apartment or whatever, and they run your background, or you go try to work at the county at the time, and we do the live scan, you're still convicted of that crime. And so there were lots and lots of issues. And in the middle of all this, we were approached by an organization called Code for America. How many people have heard of this organization? And they said essentially, hey, Joe, I'm so glad you're here. We've been talking to the DA, we've been talking to the public defender. We can automate this whole process. We have built a custom software that will scan all of the records in your system. And it will essentially pull out the relevant information, pre-populate all the forms. All you need to do is sign it, batch file it with the court, and we can get everybody resentenced in one fell swoop. And we convened all the parties, and we talked to the DA representatives, and they said, that's fine, but remember my obligation to look at everything. So you can pre-populate it all, but I want to check every single one before I agree to it, which kind of defeats the purpose of having it automated, because you have that bottleneck again, right, of the human being saying yes, no, yes, yes. And so after a lot of discussion and a lot of really, amazing work from Code for America, the DA's office was convinced that they could actually exercise their obligation under the statute and still agree to batch resentencing. And Jackie Lacey at the time, to her credit, working with the public defender, they wiped out in one fell swoop hundreds, I'll say at least thousands, tens of thousands of cannabis crimes. And I learned later that the woman who ran Code for America is Jennifer Pahlka. And I learned about her when my boss, the CEO of the county, started to read this book. And she told me, oh, Joe, you got to read this book. And I had this similar reaction, blah, 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 here we go, book on leadership. But I listened to it and I thought, no, this book is giving voice to all of the frustrations and consternations and issues that I consider myself on the implementation side that we as implementers really face. So I'm going to rifle through this presentation, and it is going to be, we're going to talk about Waterfall, but we're going to talk about Waterfall implementation and system design as an allegory for government as a whole. So, John, do I just push this? Okay, I told you that I am not a technology person. All right. Okay, so okay, all right. You all work for government? Does anyone here not work for government? Okay, all right, I'll pick on you. All right, I know we're live streaming, so I'm gonna replicate your answers. Okay, I'm gonna give you a hypothetical. You're a planning director, all right? You run the Department of Regional Planning at some municipality somewhere. And your elected leaders, city council or whatever it is, they say, gee, we have a housing crisis. It's really bad, and we need to do something about it. And what they decide to do is, we're going to be the first jurisdiction in the country to make it super easy to get an ADU permit in our jurisdiction. So ADU, accessory dwelling unit, granny flat, whatever you want to call it. We've decided it's so bad that we need to take a process that right now takes about a year, and we want to make it end-to-end from application to permit. We want to make it take 30 days. And so we are directing our planning director to, let's say they give you 3 months. In 3 months' time, we want you to turn your process from a 1-year process to a 30-day process. Okay, so you gather your team, right? And you got the planners, you got the technology people, you got everybody at the table, the fiscal people. What do you ask them? What's the first thing you want to know from them? Okay, the answer was I don't know. Okay, we want to give it a shot? The question is, how do we know that these ADUs are going to be affordable? So you're asking right now, like, I think what you're asking is this going to work, right? At the end of the day, are people going to do this? Are they even going to take advantage of this process? What are some other questions you'd want to ask? Okay, so the answer was non-negotiable steps to get a permit, and why are they non-negotiable? The critical path to getting your permit. So what you're getting at now, everyone's kind of getting at it. What does our process look like? What does our system look like here? You might have some other questions like, how many people do we have working on ADU permits? How many people do we need? What does our system look like? What does our process look like? Is it a paper process? Let's say it's a paper process. Okay, how do we shorten that? Is it really long? How long, et cetera? You're asking all these questions to get at the process because you're going to say, I got to get from a year to 30 days. How am I going to do it? Okay, let me add to the hypothetical. Let's say, it's our planning director, in that same directive, okay, that you got to shorten the process to 30 days in 3 months, they also said, we want you to put your paper process entirely online, including a payment option, because that's easiest. Make it available in the 16 most spoken languages in your jurisdiction. They want you to prioritize applications in high-need census tracts. They want you to build a dashboard, public-facing dashboard to track progress, and they want you to contract with community-based organizations to outreach the opportunity for the streamlined ADU permits. You open your inbox on Monday morning, and you already have 6 emails from CBO saying, when's the RFP coming out? So you as the planning director are stuck in the waterfall. You are on the receiving end of a policy directive, and Jennifer Pahlka describes the waterfall as cartoon pools flowing into each other, and there's no going up the waterfall. So did this mic turn off? Not me. Okay. All right. So I will just project, and there's no going up the waterfall. So basically, you're stuck with the directive. You have to do it. Like, your job is on the line now. Pahlka argues that it's an interesting argument that waterfall thinking in government and in systems design is responsible for some pretty spectacular failures. And she gives some examples. Healthcare.gov, the marquee website that was supposed to be the place to go to get your insurance when Obamacare launched, crashed on day 1. She talks about Prop 64 resentencing as a major disaster. I mentioned that earlier. She talks about the COVID stimulus payments. Do you all remember that? I think probably everybody here was eligible. And she describes an enormous backlog of millions of Americans waiting and waiting and waiting. And then she talks about, also during COVID, the Cal EDD, which is responsible for giving you your unemployment benefits. They had a backlog in the hundreds of thousands of payments of applications, and it was really quite disastrous. And so we have some warning signs of a waterfall organization. I'll walk you through them kind of using the EDD example that I just mentioned. So the EDD is a department of the state, and they're responsible, obviously, for processing unemployment checks. And during COVID, they developed a huge backlog. They just were not able to process claims timely. People were on their last dollar, and they've just been waiting for the money, and they start to call their elected officials. And every single legislator at the state is inundated with callers. The governor's office is inundated with callers. So what do the policymakers do? They start to hold hearings. They start to try to find out what is happening. So the governor, trying to help out, authorizes and directs a bunch of new claims processor hiring for the EDD. So they have a mandate to start hiring people, and they do. They start bringing in a bunch of new people who are going to work on processing claims. But it turns out that the EDD's process is really complex. And in the book, they describe somebody who's been there for 20 years saying, I'm still the new guy. You don't really know this system until you've been here 28 years because it's that complicated. It's like systems built on systems, built on systems, built on systems, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So Jennifer Pahlka is called in to assist the EDD in getting rid of this backlog, and they start running some data. And what they find is it's actually counterproductive to hire new people because the seasoned claims processors need to stop processing claims to train the new people. And the new people can only get it so far because they're not experienced enough to take it all the way through. So at some point, they start emailing their applications to the seasoned processor saying, I need your authorization for this to proceed. And what happens? It bottlenecks, right? And so the data was pretty clear that having all these new people was actually slowing down the process. So Pahlka goes to the director at the time and says, I have this data, this isn't working, look what's happening. And the director tells her, that's nice, but there's no way in hell I'm telling people, especially the governor, that I'm not hiring more staff. That's what they want me to do. That's what we're doing. She was stuck in a waterfall that started in DC, Congress and the executive branch, through the Department of Labor, to the governor, down through the, I forget the branch that the EDD reports to, but there's a state branch that they report to, then down to the EDD, plus all the oversight agencies. Even though she ran like a big organization, she was at the bottom of this really large waterfall. And at the bottom of a waterfall, in waterfall development, like when you're building a system, and in government as well, you could end up with some anomalies at the bottom of the pool, right? Because it's requirements driven. Policymakers decide the policy, they hand it off to the program people. The program people give the developers the requirements, and the developers fulfill the requirements, right? There's no user testing necessarily, or it's minimal. Does it work based on the requirements? All requirement driven. And what you get sometimes is not what you expected or what you wanted, and the product is just not super great at the end of it. There's no feedback loop, right? The developers aren't going to the policymakers and saying, hey, this isn't working. What if we did this? What if we did this? What if we did this? That's waterfall design, and that's waterfall thinking in government as well. And the anomalies at the bottom of the waterfall in government are comparable. Pahlka calls it in the book, concrete boats. And she got it from a gentleman that she dubbed Kevin. I don't think that's his real name. In fact, I think she says that's not his real name, Kevin. He worked for the VA, and he was a pretty senior technology official at the VA, and he oversaw something called the Veteran Benefits Management System. It's a very important system. It's how veterans access their benefits through the VA. And there were a couple problems, and one of the biggest problems was latency. You all know what latency is? Okay. I knew what it was, but I didn't know what it was called until I read this book, latency. So they had a system where they essentially put everything online, like an online version of their system, but it was just more or less paper that was digitized. So it was like to get through an application, you had to click through every image as though it was a piece of paper, which I think would drive us all crazy and make us want to go back to paper. And they said every time you hit the next button to get to the next image, a claims processor could get up, go start brewing a cup of coffee, come back before that next image even loaded. It took oftentimes up to 2 minutes. And Kevin, when Pahlka showed up again, she is working now for the feds, and she's trying to help government do better on the technology side. She shows up and says, Kevin, let's talk about the system. And he says, there's no need. The latency problem is resolved. And after some questioning, she learns that how they resolved it was they redefined what latency meant. Okay, so now, if it's not more than 2 minutes, you were not to report any latency. So all of their latency reports just plummeted into the ground. But anyway, so she digs in, she starts asking him these questions, and when she gets to the questions like, why do we do it this way, or why is it like this, Kevin would always say, you know, that's not a question for me. That's a question for the program people. And after a few of these interactions, she asked him, you know, why do you keep saying that you are not able to answer these questions and you're punting it to the program people? And he says in the book, this is a quote from the book, he says, quote, I would build a concrete boat if asked, so when it doesn't work, it's not our fault, right? He's stuck in the waterfall. There's an incentive for him to stick to the requirements. There is no incentive for him to be imaginative, to say this doesn't work, to go do it a different way, to start climbing back up the waterfall, to raise some concerns, right? He's in a system that incentivizes this behavior. And in fact, if you looked at his career, he was promoted time and time and time again because the fealty to the process was what mattered in his system, not outcomes. And it is kind of offensive to think of it this way, for someone to say, look, I'm just doing what I'm told, and I don't care if it doesn't work because that's what I'm told to do. Because at the time, there were 16 veterans a day committing suicide, and these folks needed benefits. And so the impact was extraordinary, right? Someone saying, I'm just going to do what I'm told. All right, that is not necessarily the outcomes that anyone had anticipated. And the question is, that sounds like a really bad example, Joe. Is it really that common? I think the answer is yes. It's very common, and sometimes it's much lower stakes than that. But it is still common and still annoying and still counterproductive and antithetical to the policy you're trying to achieve. And Pahlka uses the lovely phrase policy vomit. And what she says policy vomit is the act of dumping all the layers of policy, quote, undigested, into a form and requiring users to wade through it. So wading through the policy vomit. What you have is a lack of design. And I'll just give you an example from an organization, government organization that I won't name. And I was online and I thought to myself, let me see if I can get a water heater permit. Okay, so I go online to the system, and you go to the system of this unnamed organization. It gives you a few options. Drop-down menu, great, that's right up my alley. Drop-down menu, what do you want to do? Drop it down. There's nothing that says, I want a water heater. It says, building permit, plumbing permit, electrical permit. Okay, it's a water heater, right? It's got pipes coming in, pipes coming out, it's gas, pipes in, pipes out. I probably need a plumbing permit. Click on the plumbing permit, takes you to the next page. What's the first question? Do you need a water heater? No, it's name, address, license number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you go to the next screen. Then it says, what type of work do you want to do? Great, do the drop-down menu. Is it a water heater? No, it's basically the code, like the building code or the plumbing code or whatever it was, and the subsections of it dropped into this drop-down menu. It was like A, facility mainline, new construction. B, facility mainline, existing structure. 10% all the way down to like AD or something because they had so many options. No water heater. So you say, all right, this isn't it's not a plumbing permit. Or if it is, it's some subset of this that I don't know what it is. And if you scroll down even more, it was like, upload your site plan, upload this, upload that, your deed. It's like, what? I just need a water heater permit. So I cancel it. I say, this is probably a building permit. So I click on building permit. What's the first question? Name, address, so et cetera. This is undesigned and it's not exactly a usable service. There are many different ways to do this. I'll give you another example. Charles Schwab, I opened a custodial account. So I opened 3 custodial accounts, 90 seconds each. Name, social, yes, no, yes, yes, yes. Congratulations, here's your account number. They probably took thousands of pages of federal regulations and condensed it into multiples of yes, no questions, always pushing to the next screen. I didn't have to go look up, my mother's immigration documents. I was able to do that really quickly. So those are 2 different examples. And I had handed out earlier the $100 bills. I don't know where that is, but I will just say what you're looking at is the counties, my offices, and I take full responsibility for it, our instructions to departments on how to design a program that is ARPA compliant. If you don't know what ARPA is, it's the American Rescue Plan Act. It was passed during COVID, and it was a stimulus package. And the county received almost $2 billion through ARPA. And one of my jobs was to figure out how to spend it all. And in that process, we asked departments to design programs that are ARPA compliant. And the federal regulations were, the law was massive, the regulations were massive, there were lots of requirements, they wanted it to be equitable, they wanted you to, don't do anything non-compliant. You had guidance from Treasury that's changing every week, and we essentially took all of that information, added to it with our own equity requirements, and then prepared what you see today, a 43-page instruction booklet on how to design a program that is ARPA and county ARPA eligible. So if you wanted to, in the middle of COVID, give away food to people who needed food, before you got our money, you had to go through that process. And so it wasn't until after I read this book later where I was like, that was an example of Joe-sanctioned policy vomit, and I take full responsibility for it, and I vow to do better. So, all right. We're back up the waterfall. We have our planning director here. Okay, it's the end of month 3. Okay, you have not done what you needed to do. Your process is still a year long. You don't have an online system. You translate it into Spanish, but that's about as far as you've gotten. How are the policymakers feeling on day 91? Stressed, angry. The CBOs are calling them, when's the RFP coming out, right? They are going to take typical policymaker action, which is they will start engaging in some pretty common behaviors that you all will recognize. So Pahlka goes back up the waterfall at some point. So she spends a lot of time bashing the implementers, not really bashing, but pointing out the kind of stuff that we do that is unhelpful. And then she goes back up the waterfall. And she says, now you policymakers have been reading the first half of the book with delight, but now I'm going to talk about you a little bit. So at the top of the waterfall, she essentially makes the point that there is a deeply rooted belief that government works better as a hierarchy, policymakers at the top, and everyone else below them, right? These are your elected officials. And there's a quote in the book. It says, implementation is not what important people do, and important people don't do it. And I can, if I had a ledger, it would be full of people at the county, new people at the county who come up to me and say, I just want to do policy. And that to me says, I understand intrinsically that what I'm doing right now isn't as important as making policy. And that is kind of the mentality. And the policymakers will engage in some of these behaviors I mentioned, which is one might be, we call it unhelpful helping. So sometimes when things are stalled at the county, someone will ask me, do I need to do a motion? It's kind of like, no, we just actually need to get the work done so that we can move the ball. The motion will just basically tell us to do what we're trying to do. You can do it, but it might not get us unstuck, because what's actually happening right now is I have a mainframe system that won't talk to like my Excel file, and I need to figure that out. So unhelpful helping in the EDD context, remember, more staff, hire more staff. These are the unhelpful helpers. You have oversight. So now our planning director is sitting in front of the city council or the board of supervisors, and they're starting to ask questions, and then they ask the auditor to do an audit, and they get a third-party consultant to come in and review. All your attention now is on the oversight. You're like trying to give all the information to the auditor. You got to turn over all your emails. You got the third-party consultant coming in that has totally hijacked your team because now they're taking over. So it has taken your attention away from the actual act of implementation. You have friendly fire. These might be people in your own organization. In the VA context, they finally, leadership finally said, this is ridiculous, we're going to get it right. And they vastly improved the processing times for these applications, made it really easy to use. And what happened? A lot of applications started to come through. And people at the VA, the claims processors, were like, wait a minute, this is a lot of applications. We don't like this. We like it better when we only had a few to deal with. Can we go back to the old system? There was a really big push to go back to what they were doing because it was easier for the government as opposed to for the user. The last point here is policy rarely goes away. And this is Pahlka spends a little bit of time talking about this, and I haven't really thought about it in that much detail until I was reading the book. But essentially what she says is policy is an additive process. Every new succession of session of Congress or year at the board or the city council, they are adding policy, but they almost never get rid of old policy. So when you get a new directive to digitize your permitting system and make it only 30 days long, you probably have a code that is full of requirements that are stopping you from achieving that goal, because at some point or other, there was an anti-development sentiment for ADUs, so they built in extra requirements, and you have all these questions. You might have a fiscal manual that doesn't let you do the online transaction. You might have labor MOUs, or no planner will do more than 2 a day, or something that is, somebody at some point made a policy decision that that's helpful, and it's going to inhibit you. So policy is like the layers in architecture. You go under ancient Rome, and every 2 feet is like a different civilization. That is our policy. And in the book, Pahlka talks about somebody, I think from the state of New Jersey, who was really in hot water during COVID for not doing something he was directed to do. And he shows up at the oversight hearing with this big box of papers. It was like thousands of pages of papers. And his point was, if you want to know why I can't do any of this, these are the rules that the state of New Jersey requires me to follow when I process an application. Thousands and thousands of pages of regulation. So it kind of goes both ways. The waterfall up is the waterfall down. That is ancient Greek philosophy, and it's true today. So let me transition to why it matters. And initially, the reaction is, it matters because we could do better. This is stupid. Why we make people do this stuff? Let's just get it right. But Pahlka's argument is actually a little bit more profound than that. and not as obvious. And if you really think about it, I think she's got it right. What she says is our failures, our waterfall mindset, actually threatens democratic institutions. And when I read this, I thought of this is actually in the Hall of Records. I'm pointing up there because somebody works there. I thought of an interaction where I was in the basement of the Hall of Records, waiting in the elevator to go up, and the parking lot's right there, and it's a weird place. It looks like a scene out of a movie from like 1930s submarine or something. There's noises like, you don't know what is happening down there. Somebody comes in from the parking lot, a member of the public with like a Redwell folder full of papers and his kids, and he takes 2 steps into the lobby, and he looks around, and he's like, this place is a dump. His first impression was so bad that you knew he was going to get terrible service, even if it was fantastic service, because he was primed to have a negative reaction. That is the case with our services. Joe needs a water heater. I'm already mad. Like by the time I show up at the counter, by the way, the counter's open from like 10 to noon and then 2 to 4, Monday through Thursday. I'm already mad when I'm there. And I don't feel like I'm getting the right service, but I don't have a choice. I can't go from Schwab to some other brokerage house. I can't drive to the next city over and get a permit. I got to go to the city that issues my permits. And so there's a study in the book that says those people who have to access benefits, government benefits, are less likely to vote than people who don't. And the study does draw some causation between their experience with government, the sort of offensive level of questions. I need some CalFresh benefits, and I'm answering a question on, do I have a funeral plot, right, to establish my net worth? So it actually inhibits people's faith and trust in government. It does set us back on our equity goals. I mean, there is a substantial push in government to be more equitable. And when you think about the time tax and the phrase in the book that paperwork favors the powerful, these are things that actually prevent people from getting done what they need to do. So despite our best intentions, if we have undigested policy vomit on the back end of a really well informed policy, we are going to still fail on our equity promises. And lastly, once we know, this is kind of the point of the book, and there is a bit of a call to action in the book. Once we know it's happening, we have an obligation and the ability to do better. And this is where I give credit to our CEO for reading the book and understanding, okay, we have these same problems in the county. We need to take action to do better. And that's why John had to sit through 2 of these presentations already and now a third. So we know what the issues are now. We can spot them. I can see the Joe sanctioned policy vomit up there. How do we become agile? Again, agile as an allegory for government as a whole. There are a few takeaways from the book. I've condensed into one slide, 100 pages. So I do encourage you to read the book. In fact, we have made extra copies available at county libraries, including audiobook licenses. So if you don't read anymore like me, you just listen, you can grab an audiobook. We have to think about who's at the table, right? If you're making policy without the implementers, without the data folks, without the team of people who are actually responsible for delivering the product, that may that may not yield you exactly what you're thinking about. You're sitting at a table, I'm a policymaker, I have an advocate, I have an interest group, boom, this is a good policy, let's do it. You end up with your ADU example, right? But if you had brought your planning director in and the team and started to work on the problem from a more, I'll call it an implementation perspective, and then, developed the policy implementation steps around that, not changing the policy, but changing the steps, then I think you would have a much better outcome. User input, we talked about concrete boats. There is a opportunity when we're designing policy to actually do more on user input. There are a couple concepts in the book which I'm sure you're familiar with. One is user-centered design, where you're actually, watch somebody interact with the system and then change it until it makes sense, until it's as quick as possible, as easy as possible for people. One is a distinction between project management and product management. Pahlka spends a lot of time on this distinction. What she means is it's one thing to take a project from A to Z. Those people are really important. We need them. But we also need people to focus on the actual product itself, make it work. Implementation must inform policy. So not, even if it's not at the front end, during the implementation stage, there has to be that feedback loop. If you think about our ADU example again, you might try things like starting smaller, focusing on the process and the design, using data, building trust, etc. The last thing on this list is, since it's data and donuts, this is my last slide and my last bullet point. I'm going to close on data. And I have become like a data, I don't know what the word is, zealous convert. I just like, before I understood data was important, but now I understand that you can actually proactively go out and figure out what kind of data you want and what you want to pull and what you want to analyze before you even start something and actually get the data you need. It has been really powerful for us at the county to do things that way. And John was one of my first experiences of doing that back in 2016. So for data, Pahlka makes this point. She got a couple paragraphs here I'm going to read out directly out of the book. She says, quote, "A sure sign of a waterfall organization is how the people within it treat data. In an agile, empowered organization, data is a useful tool for adjusting course. The people in the organization not only have access to data and the ability to understand it, but have the power to decide what to do based on it. If the compass says you've drifted off course, no one summons the inspector general or calls for a hearing. You just turn the wheel." That's agile. And then she says, in a waterfall organization, on the other hand, data functions less like a compass that helps you steer and more like an after-the-fact evaluation, a grade you get that says how well or poorly you did on something that has already happened. And so I'll leave you with that thought. And as you are working with your leadership and whatever organization you work at, remember to remind them, data is a compass, not a grade, and maybe make a sticker or something and wear it to the meeting so that everybody knows what your view on it is, because I think it's really critically important. The inscription in the book is to public servants everywhere, don't give up. It's a call to action. It's not a government bashing session, although it feels like that sometimes. But I think after having read the book, I'm better for it. I know our teams have read it, and they are also cognizant of the traps that we tend to fall into. And we think at least our products, our services are better because of it. So thank you.